Rome has collapsed, and your hearts are outraged by this. Rome was built by men like yourself. Since when did you believe that men had the power to build things that are eternal? Your souls, filled with the light of the Holy Spirit, will not perish. St. Augustine of Hippo, circa 426 AD. Hi, I'm Mason, and this is The Sixth Age, a medieval history podcast. We take it for granted that the Roman Empire fell in 476 AD. That's what it says in our history books. The barbarian Odoacer overthrew the last Roman emperor, a boy named Romulus, nicknamed Little Augustus, and proclaimed himself king of Italy, thus bringing an end to what had been the most powerful empire in the Mediterranean world for 8 centuries. With the so-called fall of Rome, the medieval age began, or that's what Renaissance historians would have you believe. But the purpose of this podcast is to look at medieval history through the medieval perspective. So while we might think that Rome fell in 476 AD, would a medieval person have seen it that way? From the medieval perspective, the Roman Empire didn't necessarily fall, but it did change. So let's talk about the ways in which Rome changed, starting with where medieval people believed their time period to have began, with the death of Jesus of Nazareth in 33 AD. While modern historians view Roman history and the history of Christianity as separate subjects, medieval people viewed the Roman Empire and Christianity as being intrinsically linked. While the Roman state did originally persecute Christians, it later co-opted the new Christ cult, so that by the time Rome fell in 476 AD, Roman language, culture, and institutions were very much a part of the Christian faith. So, as we talk about Rome in this podcast, try to separate the image you may have of Rome as being anti-Christian from what we're talking about. In the medieval view, Rome was inseparable from Christianity. The languages of the church, Latin and Greek, were also the two main languages of the Roman Empire. And the two halves of the Christian church were headquartered in the imperial capitals of Rome and Constantinople. At the time of Jesus' birth in Judea, the Roman Republic had come to an end. While the Republic was still a legal entity in practice, Augustus had turned the Roman Senate into a rubber stamping mechanism for his policies. It is telling that when noble Romans were unhappy with an emperor, they didn't clamor for the return of the Republic, they just tried to install a new emperor. Roman politics had effectively shifted to a point where the idea of the Roman Empire required a Roman emperor. By the time of Jesus' crucifixion, Rome was supreme in the Mediterranean world. It had destroyed the city of Carthage, Rome's main rival in the Mediterranean, 2 centuries previously. Greece, the ancestral homeland of a host of civilizations that spread across the Mediterranean, was solidly under Roman control. The last vestige of Alexander the Great's empire, Ptolemaic Egypt, was annexed by Rome under Augustus. Rome also gained a habit of assimilating subject peoples under its rule, to the point where non-Romans and even non-Italians were able to become emperor by the end of the 3rd century. This assimilation went both ways, as subject peoples adopted Roman dress, language, culture, and appearance, and as Romans adopted subject peoples' gods and goods. When the Emperor Caracalla issued the Antonine Constitution in 212 AD, Rome was no longer an empire in the colonial sense, but rather an empire in the universal sense. The Antonine Constitution granted Roman citizenship to all free men in the empire, making all free people part of the empire's global civilizing project. This idea that Rome was a universal empire with jurisdiction over the whole world and all civilized people within it didn't just disappear when the Roman Empire collapsed in the West. It was reproduced in medieval institutions, especially in the Christian church. The flow of culture between Rome and its conquered lands is most apparent in the popularity of certain mystery cults from the East among the Roman elite. The empire's upper classes were fascinated by these mystery cults to the extent that some native Romans favored Eastern gods over the Latin ones. The cult of Isis, for example, centered on the worship of the Egyptian queen goddess Isis, a magician and the sister and wife to Osiris, lord of the dead. To some Romans, the Isis cult held a certain level of exotic appeal. It involved magic, was associated with death and rebirth, and it centered on the worship of a feminine being, which had an appeal for women who were otherwise marginalized in Roman society. Keep an eye on these themes because they'll be reproduced more or less in the fascination of Christianity among some of the Roman elite. The Roman Empire brought a period of relative stability and prosperity to the Mediterranean world, but by the 3rd century AD, that period was coming to an end. The empire was plagued by a series of civil wars, invasions, uprisings, and a major epidemic. In 5 decades, 26 men claimed the title of emperor, and at the height of the crisis, the Roman Empire split into 3 independent states. That is, until the Roman general Aurelian was proclaimed emperor, he defeated the breakaway states and reunified the empire into a single state. For this, the Roman Senate declared Aurelian Restitutor Orbis, the restorer of the world. But, having just spent years reunifying the empire through military conquest, Aurelian sought to further unify the empire under a single religious ideology. It appears that his mother may have been a priestess of Sol Invictus, that is, the god of the unconquered sun. Sol Invictus was a Syrian national god spread throughout the Roman Empire by Syrian soldiers, merchants, and slaves. It appears that the god took on Greek and Roman characteristics as the cult grew, and the sun god was especially popular with members of the Roman military. As Aurelian was a military man, it is unsurprising that he viewed the god with favor, and he probably believed that Sol Invictus had played some role in his very successful military career. Aurelian, as ruler of an increasingly divided empire, needed a unifying symbol. So he chose Sol Invictus as that symbol, and he made Sol Invictus the chief god of the Roman Empire, supplanting the role of Jupiter Capitolinus as chief patron of the Roman state. Sol Invictus became a supranational figure, a chief god that all Romans could pray to, and this is the key part, without totally giving up their own national cults. A Roman Egyptian, for example, could acknowledge the primacy of Sol Invictus without necessarily giving up the worship of Osiris, Isis, or Horus. What does Aurelian's use of Sol Invictus have to do with medieval Christianity? Well, Aurelian chose a military god patron from the east to act as a unifying force throughout his divided empire. In many ways, he laid the foundation for the imperial adoption of Christianity, as we will see the first Christian emperor, Constantine, follow a similar pattern. The crisis of the 3rd century came to an end with the rule of the Emperor Diocletian, who instituted the Tetrarchy, a system in which 4 co-emperors would rule the world as partners. Diocletian's tetrarchic system is important in that it created the idea of a Western Roman Empire centered on Rome and an Eastern Roman Empire centered on the Greek city-states of the East. Diocletian was also known for instituting the Diocletianic persecution, the most widespread government persecution effort of Christians in the Roman world. Diocletian worked incredibly hard to reunify the empire after the division of the 3rd century. By elevating successful Roman politicians and generals like Constantius to the co-emperorship, Diocletian's bureaucracy was able to simultaneously manage crises on the empire's far eastern and far western fringes, thus re-establishing empire-wide stability. Diocletian, being a pious man, wished to thank the gods for his success. His priests, however, were unable to complete their sacrificial ritual, and somehow the chief priest gets it into his head that it's because of these Christians that they can't finish their ritual. Now, there's a misconception that the Roman Empire was religiously intolerant. For most of its history, the Roman Empire was extremely tolerant of foreign gods. As we've seen, many of the gods of conquered peoples were even integrated into the Roman pantheon. Roman rulers were themselves very accepting of new gods, so long as they conformed to standards of Roman morality and their worship was not detrimental to public order. To my knowledge, there were only 3 faiths that the Romans really considered to be problematic: Celtic polytheism, Judaism, and Christianity. Celtic polytheism was viewed with scorn because Celtic druids, according to Roman sources, performed human sacrifices, which were not allowable according to Roman norms. The other 2 faiths, Judaism and Christianity, were problematic because they only accepted the existence of one God. In the Roman view, Jews and Christians were unwilling to integrate their faith with Roman norms because they did not perform the sacrifices that were required to the chief gods of the empire, like Jupiter Capitolinus or Sol Invictus, because Jews and Christians believed that doing so would anger their own sole god. Romans were notoriously superstitious, and anyone who refused to perform the required civic sacrifices to the gods was believed to be literally endangering the empire by angering those same gods. By the time of the Diocletianic persecution, the Roman state had come to accept the existence of the Jews and no longer viewed them specifically as a threat to the public order. But the new Christ cult was seriously problematic because its adherents would not honor the patron gods of the Roman state, nor would they perform sacrifices on behalf of the Roman emperor. In effect, Christians were viewed as fundamentally disloyal, and Diocletian viewed them as a destabilizing influence on the empire that he had just painstakingly reassembled. Diocletian ultimately issued 3 edicts over the course of 3 years, with the final edict decreeing that every community in the empire must make public sacrifices to the gods. Those who refused to sacrifice were considered Christians, and they could be imprisoned, tortured, and executed, especially if they refused to recant their faith. The goal of the persecution was not to exterminate Christians, but to force Christians to publicly renounce their faith. Faced with torture and death, many Christians chose to do just that. This became a major source of contention within the Christian community when the persecution ended, as Christians who were persecuted for refusing to recant their faith struggled to reconcile with those Christians who apostatized in order to escape torture or death. Well, after instituting these laws targeting the Christian community, Diocletian retired. One of his co-emperors, Constantius, became chief emperor of the West until he died in 305 AD. Constantius's troops acclaimed Constantius's son, Constantine, as emperor. Constantine had been on campaign with his father in Britain when he died, so it makes sense that Constantius's troops had a special affinity for Constantine. The 2 emperors of the West, Maxentius and Constantine, seem to have grudgingly accepted each other's existence at first, but there was kind of a natural tension between the 2 of them over which of them was the chief emperor of the West. The Eastern Emperor recognized Constantine as the chief Western Emperor, which granted him some legitimacy, but Constantine only controlled Spain, Britain, and France, and Maxentius controlled Italy and Africa, which meant Maxentius had Rome itself under his control, thus giving him some legitimacy to be the chief Roman emperor. Constantine and Maxentius's relationship broke down when Maxentius's father, Maximian, was killed in a failed coup attempt against Constantine. Constantine marched his army into Italy, ready to overthrow Maxentius and claim total control of the Western Empire, and the 2 armies faced off across the river Tiber at a place called the Milvian Bridge. But Constantine, apparently superstitious, sought the aid of a mysterious god in his fight against Maxentius. So, one of Constantine's biographers, Eusebius, writes after Constantine's death this story that he allegedly heard from Constantine personally. Honestly, Eusebius really looked up to Constantine, so I don't doubt that Constantine probably told this story and that Eusebius believed it. Whether or not it literally actually happened is immaterial, because the story as Eusebius tells it is what ends up getting codified as the truth. And it is Eusebius' story that sets the tone for medieval Christianity. So, according to this story, before the battle with Maxentius, Constantine prays, asking for a god to grant him victory. After his prayer, Constantine goes outside, and he and his whole army see a cross of light appear in the sky, with the words, "In this sign, conquer," appearing beneath it. Constantine doesn't understand what it means at first, but then he goes to sleep, and Jesus Christ appears to him in a dream. Jesus told Constantine to make the sign of the palabra, basically a P intersected with an X, which was a symbol that represented the Greek letters for Christ's name, and to put that sign on the shields of his soldiers. Constantine ordered his men to paint the sign on their shields, and lo and behold, not only do they defeat Maxentius's army, but Maxentius and many of his men drown in the river Tiber as they try to retreat. Thus, Constantine became the sole ruler of the West, thanks, supposedly, to Jesus Christ. Eusebius makes it clear that Maxentius put his trust in the pagan gods, and they could not protect him. Constantine's victory over Maxentius becomes symbolic of the supposed coming victory of Christianity over paganism, and it establishes the precedent of Christianity as being a winner's religion. This myth gets codified over time and ends up playing a huge role in the Christianization not only of Rome, but of people all over Europe. You see, before Constantine, Christianity had a bit of a brand issue. Jesus' focus on preaching to the poor, the meek, and the oppressed didn't mesh well with the notoriously hierarchical Roman society. Christianity was also somewhat stigmatized because it was viewed as an Eastern religion, and so it was kind of viewed as being effeminate and unmartial. You might remember Celsus from the last episode. He was the Greek philosopher who was accused by the church father Origen of claiming that Jesus was not actually fathered by God, but instead by a Roman authority named Pantera. Well, Origen also claims that Celsus said Christianity was a religion of the stupid, people like the poor, slaves, women, and children, and not of educated, Greek philosophers like himself. So obviously there's a lot of sexism and classism that's coming through in this critique of Christianity. Women and children were at the bottom of Roman society, and their lives were totally controlled by elite men. It makes sense then that Jesus, who preached about the special role of the lowly, the poor, and the meek in the kingdom of heaven, had a special appeal for those at the bottom of Roman society. Indeed, many of the early leaders of Christian communities were women who had special roles as prophetesses, biblical scholars, and instructors of the Christian faith. Christianity followed a similar path as the cults of Isis and of Sol Invictus. It spread from the East among women and slaves until it was eventually adopted by those in the Roman elite. With the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, Christianity was rebranded as a religion not just for the poor and the oppressed, but also for the victorious, people like Constantine who held societal power. According to Constantine, he became emperor of the West because the Christian God granted him victory in battle. The idea that God would put his finger on the scale in battle makes a kind of sense because pre-modern battles were inherently chaotic. And as much as military historians like to talk about the importance of tactics, much of what happens in battle could be left up to chance. So people like Aurelian and Constantine, who tended to win military victories, therefore kind of chalked up their track record to the favor of a supreme being. Constantine followed in Aurelian's footsteps in using his martial prowess to signify a kind of divine favor. With his rule secured in the West, Constantine met the Emperor of the East in the city of Milan. Together, the two emperors declared an end to the persecution of Christians. They also restored confiscated church property, and they decreed the formal toleration of all faiths in the empire. Let me be clear, though, Constantine did not make Christianity the imperial state religion, nor did he outlaw paganism. He did, however, make the Christian god his favored deity in the same way that Aurelian did with Sol Invictus. Obviously, there's a difference here because worshippers of Sol Invictus could also worship other gods, while worshippers of the Christian god were technically forbidden. That's not to say that there wasn't some bending of the rules. But Constantine seems to have favored Christianity for much of the same reason Aurelian favored Sol Invictus. Both faiths were able to act as a unifying force by centralizing faith in one chief deity, and both faiths were associated with military victory. By unifying the empire in the worship of one deity, Constantine further established Aurelian's idea of universal Roman authority under one god and one emperor. But Constantine wasn't the sole emperor yet. There was still the emperor of the East, Licinius, and while Constantine seems to have tolerated his co-emperor's existence while he was still consolidating his own authority in the West, the two emperors quarreled repeatedly. Eusebius chalks Constantine's decision to oust Licinius up to Licinius's persecution of the Christian church. It's more likely, I think, that the two men were just both ambitious and neither was really able to fully dominate the other, so conflict naturally sprung up. Constantine eventually defeated Licinius and brought an end to Diocletian's tetrarchy, thus reunifying the empire under his sole rule. After defeating Licinius, Constantine gives a speech known as the Oration to the Saints. This speech, recorded by Eusebius, details Constantine's logic in favoring Christianity over the myriad national cults of the empire. According to Constantine, these cults divided people by allowing them to identify themselves with one god or another. The Greeks, in his view of history, were separate from the Egyptians because of their different religious preferences. Constantine called on the people of his empire to give up these diverse gods and thus give up the idea that they are separate from each other. Believe in the one true God, Constantine said, and realize that humanity should be ruled by one God, one state, one empire, and most importantly, one emperor. Constantine makes the case for Christian universality, the idea that the whole world should be united through their worship of the one true God. Constantine combined the ideas of political unity and religious unity into a kind of super unity. Constantine also effectively combined Christianity and the Roman Empire to the point that Roman imperial favor allowed Christianity to flourish, and Christianity came to be a spiritual successor to the idea of universal empire that Rome promulgated with the Antonine Constitution. Like the cult of Isis or Sol Invictus, this religion from the East, favored by people at the bottom of the Roman socio-cultural hierarchy, was able to spread throughout the empire until it became a new way for people to identify themselves with each other, beyond their ethnic, linguistic, cultural, or class identities. Christianity's early decision to make a conscious break from Judaism and preach the good news of Christ to all people instead of people of the Jewish ethnicity made it useful for Constantine. By co-opting Christianity, he turned the religion of the people at the bottom of society into legitimacy for the people at the very top. But Constantine's unity project was threatened by Christianity's internal divisions. Because of the inherent Christian idea of there being only one God and thus one path to salvation, there was a very real and present fear in early Christian communities of doctrinal disagreements resulting in, someone being condemned to hell. Jesus in the Gospels is very clear that there is only one path to salvation, and that's through him. But because of his tendency to teach through parables, the one path to salvation was largely open to interpretation. Constantine preferred Christianity because of its natural tendency towards unity. So obviously, he didn't have a lot of tolerance for disagreements that threatened Christian unity from within. The first issue that Constantinian Christianity faced was the Donatist controversy. Remember how I said there was a divide between the Christians who complied with the Diocletianic persecution and those who didn't? Some of the hardcore Christians who refused to recant their faith started to claim that any baptisms performed by members of the clergy who had recanted the faith were actually invalid. Constantine's council clamped down on this idea hard, and they ultimately decided that the relative purity of a priest didn't have anything to do with the validity of the sacraments that priest performed. While the Donatist controversy would persist for another century, Constantine had made it clear that the imperially sanctioned version of Christianity rejected it. The other issue that Constantinian Christianity faced was Arianism. There was a fundamental disagreement among early Christians about whether Jesus, as the Son of God, had always existed or whether Jesus was created by God the Father. Arian Christians, named after the Alexandrian priest Arius, took the view that Jesus was created by God the Father and thus he was not eternal. The Council of Nicaea, convened by Constantine, rejected this view. According to the Council of Nicaea, God was one being in three parts, that of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Each of these parts was co-eternal, none preceded any of the others. Therefore, Jesus, as the Son of God, was with the Father from the very beginning of the world. Jesus could therefore legitimately be said to be the Son of God and also God himself. With Constantine's intervention, the Donatists and Arians became the heretics, that is, the followers of Christian doctrine that was not imperially sanctioned. While the doctrinal differences between the sanctioned and unsanctioned versions of Christianity may not seem important to us, it is difficult to overstate their importance to the Christian community at the time. Like I said before, Christians fundamentally believed that there was really only one path towards salvation, and disagreements about that path led to some serious anxiety within the community. The Christianity promulgated by Constantine's councils would become the basis for the Roman Church, while the heretical Christian churches would be viewed with disdain and hatred by Roman Christians for centuries. Honestly, they thought that heretical Christians were even worse than the pagans, because Roman Christians believed that heretics posed more of a theological risk because they could subvert the Christian faith. Let's step away from Constantine's religious innovations for a second. Constantine made one other serious innovation in the history of the empire by establishing a new imperial capital, hundreds of miles away from the empire's traditional capital in Rome. Constantine looked to the Greek colony of Byzantium, established on the Bosphorus Straits, as the ideal location for his new city. This is because Byzantium was located between the Danube and Persian frontiers, which were the two flashpoints that required direct imperial supervision. Byzantium was also supplyable by sea, so the city could be fed by Greek and Egyptian shipping. So Constantine declared Byzantium as his new capital, and he renamed the city Constantinople, that is, the city of Constantine. The Roman Empire might always consider the city of Rome to be its spiritual home, but Constantine was showing just how much the idea of the Roman Empire had outgrown the city from which it took its name. His empire was, after all, universal, so there was no need for it to constrain its governance by relying on a city that was just too far from the imperial frontiers to govern effectively. Because of Constantine, the Roman Empire had two capitals, the eternal city of Rome itself and the new imperial city of Constantinople. But as imperial power in the West declined after Constantine's death, the city of Constantinople would become the center of the Roman Empire in the East. Rome might maintain its preeminence in the European world, but it wouldn't do so as the headquarters of the empire, rather as the headquarters of a thoroughly Romanized institution, the new Constantinian Christian Church. After Constantine died, there was no assurance that Christianity would continue to grow into the behemoth of a religion that it became. Paganism was still very much alive and well within the empire, and Christianity could have easily been supplanted by a new cult, much in the way that Aurelian's cult of Sol Invictus was supplanted by Diocletian's reaffirmed preference for Jupiter Capitolinus or Constantine's own preference for the Christ. But Christianity's focus on life after death and the supposed good conduct of its believers made the new faith extremely palatable to the peoples of the empire. Constantine also made the new church fabulously wealthy, which added a new level of prestige to the burgeoning imperial faith. Between the wealth of the new church, the Christian focus on charity and generosity, and the appeal of unifying belief, Christianity became further entrenched in the empire. This wasn't an immediate shift, but a gradual process. But as the rise of Christianity occurred with the simultaneous decline of Roman power in the West, some pagan thinkers began to view the rise of Christianity as being the cause of imperial decline. By the turn of the 5th century, the empire's frontiers in the West were crumbling. Tribes that had lived outside the imperial borders and had existed largely without the empire's Hellenizing influences were crossing into Roman territory and destabilizing the region as they searched for food, land, and safety. The greatest calamity came in 410 AD when Alaric, king of the Goths, sacked the eternal city of Rome itself. The empire had been unable even to defend its spiritual home from the so-called barbarian advance. The Goths raped and robbed their way through the eternal city, sparing only those who sought refuge in Christian temples. This is because Alaric was a Christian, albeit an Arian Christian, so he probably feared divine retribution if he tried to attack the temples themselves. To the Roman elite, many of whom were still practicing Greco-Roman pagans by the time Rome was sacked, the sack of Rome was essentially a divine warning. Surely the gods of the Romans were showing their displeasure at the imperial tendency towards Christianity. It was against voices like these that our old friend St. Augustine penned The City of God, one of the greatest works of Christian theology ever written. It's hard to overstate the importance of the city of God in the medieval worldview. In this book, Augustine took on the pagan philosophers who claimed that the gods of Rome were punishing the empire by allowing the sack of the eternal city. Augustine ridiculed the Roman proliferation of gods in one particularly sarcastic passage. He noted that the Romans worshipped separate gods for the doorknob, door hinges, and the wood of the door, and questions why you would worship gods who are so powerless that they can only govern one part of a door, when instead you could worship the Christian God who was so powerful that he held sole dominion over everything. Faced with the crumbling Roman world, Augustine compared the vulnerable, temporal city of man with the invulnerable, immortal city of God. Rome, though it was nicknamed the Eternal City, was made of brick and marble. It could crumble. Augustine instead called the attention of his readers to the thing that could not crumble, their immortal souls. God, in allowing Rome to be sacked, was teaching his children not to rely on the things of this world, but to trust in the one unassailable truth that only through God could humanity be saved. Augustine took note of the fact that the Goths did not attack Christian temples, and though many Christians were raped, injured, and killed, Augustine argued that such injuries ultimately served God's purpose in warning his people against the dangers of pride. So, yeah. Moving on. Despite that kind of insensitivity, Augustine's work did serve as a balm to a Christian community that was trying to reconcile their faith in a loving creator with the chaos and suffering that was occurring across the empire in the 5th century. Through Augustine's words, Christians were able to rest assured that even the collapse of the world as they knew it could ultimately serve God's purpose. Augustine essentially reassured Christians that their trust in God was not in vain. Remember, Augustine viewed himself as being situated in the middle of the 6th age, that is, the final 1,000 years before the world would ultimately end and God would establish his eternal kingdom, which, unlike Rome, would never fall. In writing The City of God, Augustine may have been trying to prepare the Christian community for even greater calamities than the sack of Rome, because he believed that the world would only get more chaotic as humankind accelerated on its 1,000-year track towards Judgment Day. Shit is gonna get bad, Augustine says, so don't trust in the stuff that'll break. Know that God has a purpose for everything, and that if you trust in him, things will all work out. The settlement of non-Greek speaking peoples within the imperial frontiers further destabilized Roman control in the West. The leaders of these non-Greek speaking tribes became more powerful than traditional Roman institutions. The influence of the Roman court over economic and military administration waned as these tribal leaders gained power and influence. But while these tribes undermined Roman power in the West, Roman power in the East remained more or less stable. The eastern provinces of the empire were wealthier, easier to defend, and they were more easily managed from Constantinople than the western provinces were managed from Rome. The imperial court in the East maintained its influence over its respective military, while in the West it was the military that influenced the Western imperial court. In 476, the Gothic general Odoacer deposed the boy emperor of the West, Romulus, nicknamed Little Augustus, and sent him into exile. Now, this is when historians say the Roman Empire came to an end, as the traditional heartland of the Roman Empire, central Italy, was no longer directly administered by Roman officials. But the principle of a universal world empire still remained intact, and Odoacer, out of deference for this principle, recognized the Roman emperor in the East as his nominal overlord. While the Roman Empire was no longer a factor in the daily administration of the Western provinces, its spirit was intact. Christian kings across Europe still recognized the Roman court in Constantinople as the preeminent court of the world. And the symbols of imperial rule in Constantinople, like the imperial diadem, became the symbols that the so-called barbarian kings in the West used to legitimize their own rule. Rome became associated with that principle of universal overlordship, and Western kings, when they tried to expand their authority, often did so in Roman language or Roman terms. The Eastern Roman Empire, or as it is sometimes called by historians, the Byzantine Empire, existed throughout the entire medieval period. Roman power in the East proved so enduring that it survived 1,000 years after Roman power in the West collapsed. This empire, however, is often viewed by historians as being insufficiently Roman to be called a Roman Empire. Because its people spoke Greek rather than Latin, and they legitimized their rule through the intercession of the divine, which was viewed as kind of a Greek tradition, rather than through the civic institutions of Rome. But these same historians who try to argue that the Eastern Roman Empire wasn't really a Roman Empire, that they failed to account for the fact that the Western Empire had taken on a decidedly Greek character by the time of Aurelian. Constantine, in establishing a new imperial capital in a decidedly Greek portion of the empire, may have accelerated Greek influence in the development of new institutions, but the people of the East still considered themselves to be Romans. They called themselves Romans, not in the sense of being from Rome, the city, but in the sense of being the legitimate inheritors of the Roman idea of a universal empire. Roman inheritance was an important factor in the West as well. As Germanic tribes moved into former imperial territory, they blended their institutions with Roman ones. The Franks, in particular, blended their language with Latin, becoming modern-day French eventually. They also adopted certain aspects of Roman law, and they even adopted Roman mythology, as they claimed to be the descendants of the ancient Trojans. Clovis, the founder of the French Merovingian dynasty, still recognized the preeminence of the Eastern Roman Empire, and he wrote letters to the Eastern Roman Emperor asking to be granted the title of consul. So while the day-to-day administration of the West was no longer being administered by the Roman Empire, this idea of Roman preeminence was still very much alive. The idea that there must be a Roman emperor who all Christians naturally owed allegiance to was so powerful that when Empress Irene took the Eastern Roman throne, the Pope in Rome decided that there needed to be a new Western emperor. After all, he didn't think that Christendom could owe allegiance to a woman. There was such a need for the idea of legitimate Roman rulership that Western kings and churchmen could not merely ignore the inconvenient female empress. They had to replace her with a legitimate male emperor of their own. It is for this reason that Pope Leo III decided to grant Charles, king of the Franks and the Lombards, the title of Augustus, that is, Emperor of the Romans. Charlemagne, as he is now known, became the first emperor of the West in 400 years. Charlemagne posited his rule as kind of fulfilling the need for a universal Christian empire, and he consciously imitated the Romans in expanding infrastructure projects, sponsoring artwork, and redefining law codes. The decision by the Pope to effectively create a Western emperorship furthered the divide between the so-called Latin West, where churchmen practiced their faith in the language of Rome, and the Greek East, where Greek was the language of the church. It is telling that the two great cities of the Roman Empire, that is, Rome and Constantinople, would remain the cultural, political, and religious centers for the medieval West and East, respectively. So, can we really say that the medieval era began with the fall of the Roman Empire? Can we really even say that the Roman Empire truly fell in 476 AD? After all, the Eastern Roman Empire persisted until the Ottomans conquered Constantinople in 1453, and there would be a Roman emperor recognized in the Catholic West until Napoleon abolished the Holy Roman Empire in 1806. The idea of Rome was very much alive throughout the Middle Ages, and the barbarian peoples living in former Roman territory sought to remake Roman institutions in their own images. Perhaps as the brick and mortar of Rome crumbled, it was the spirit of the empire that remained alive, as men like Charlemagne tried to emulate the emperors of the past. It was that same spirit that was kept alive by the host of churchmen who spoke and wrote in the empire's languages of Greek and Latin, as they told and retold the mythologies and histories of the classical world. Join us next week for a brief survey of the peoples and faiths that sprung up across Europe in the wake of the Western Roman Empire's fall or transformation, as we see how the barbarian invaders remade Europe into what we call medieval Europe.